Okay, so today we are here with our Armenian Assembly Summer Internship Program interns for 2017. We have Kira Chamberlain, we have Satanik Beglarian, are you showing it? And Rachel Minasyan. And we are all here. My name is Arpi Vartanian. I'm the Regional Director for the Armenian Assembly based here in Yerevan. And today we have with us a very special guest who's going to talk to us about a variety of things. Mr. Sarkis Balkhian was an intern in our Washington-based program in 2007. And he worked at the Armenian National Institute. And in 2008, he decided to come to Armenia and do our internship program here in Armenia. Remind me, please, where did you work here?
I worked for a few weeks at the International Center for Human Development, and then I moved on to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs
right.
and the Armenian Genocide Museum-Institute.
Okay. And I mentioned to you earlier, Kira, our intern, is working at the International Center for Human Development, so we've got that in common too, and she's interested in a lot of things that you're going to have to say. So, Sarkis-chan, if you could just share with us your thoughts about the internship program, where things led you, either in Washington and or in Armenia, but also about your work with the Aleppo organization, working with Syrian Armenians, and you work with Human Rights Watch right now. And that sounds fascinating. So I think we'd all like to hear about that as well. Okay?
Thank you.
And you could talk for like 15, 20, 30 minutes if you want, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief, and then I'd rather take questions and answer those than just go on speaking for hours.
Thank you.
In terms of, I studied, my bachelor's degree was in political science and Holocaust and genocide studies. So the genocide issue, growing up as a Syrian Armenian who was born and raised in Aleppo, who's a descendant of a genocide survivor, was a critical part of my upbringing, and therefore I chose Clark University specifically because they have a Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. It's a PhD program, but you can also do a concentration in Holocaust and Genocide Studies for a bachelor's degree or even master's. So at the time, in 2007, I think I was a sophomore, and the Armenian National Institute, being one of the most reputable research organizations that is dedicated, led by Mr. Ruben Adalian, that is dedicated in terms of conducting research and advocacy work related to the Armenian genocide, and as well as the Armenian Assembly of America and the advocacy and the lobbying work that they do in Washington, D.C. It seemed like the perfect fit for me to apply for the internship at the time. And I was there in Washington, D.C. At the time, the internship, the interns would gather at the Georgetown campus. I'm not sure what's the situation at the moment, but the Georgetown campus life was amazing. The internship itself was extremely fulfilling. Working with Mr. Adalian was just one of the best experiences that I've had. Even at this point in my life, I think it's one of the most memorable experiences I've had, because even at the age of 20 or so, you got a lot of opportunities to do research, a lot of compilations that are relevant to the work that the Armenian National Institute does. And then in 2008, it was kind of a natural sequel to the 2007 summer. I mean, it was such a great experience in Washington, D.C., and I applied for the internship through the Armenian Assembly to do the summer internship in Yerevan, like you're all doing at the moment. And initially I was placed with the International Center for Human Development and the Armenian Genocide Museum-Institute, working with Mr. Haik Demoyan. And then a few weeks later, I was able to get a placement at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in their Middle East division. And it was a choice between ICHD and the Middle East and North Africa division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And because my primary interests were genocide and Middle East issues, I chose to continue the internship with the ministry, with MFA. The internship was again, it was very interesting, a little bit less professional maybe than the one that I experienced with Ani in Washington, D.C., but it was a matter of being self-motivated and coming up with different projects that you can do with MFA and the AGMI, and being an instigator as opposed to waiting on people to give you tasks. So it was still a very interesting experience with both AGMI and MFA. I ended up compiling or putting together a report that I'm not sure if the ministry ever used, but it was related to the legal claims of Armenians to the lands of quote-unquote Western Armenia. And it was basically a study that I did independently with some guidance from the MFA directors at the time. And it was basically an investigation and research into the Treaty of Sevres and all the other relevant treaties that were signed at the time that could potentially facilitate or can aid the Armenian claims for Western Armenia or Eastern Turkey, modern day Turkey. It was a great experience, and a lot of the experiences that I had, and as I mentioned, growing up, genocide and human rights issues was a primary focus of mine, and through my education and also through the internship programs that I think the Armenian Assembly internships, both in 2007 and 2008, have helped me a lot along the way since then, throughout my career and also my educational path since then. In 2009, when I graduated from Clark, I returned back to Aleppo for almost a year, but because there were limited opportunities for political engagement, there wasn't a civil society. Civil society was essentially non-existent in Syria at the time. I decided to fulfill one of my long-term dreams of moving to Armenia, so I moved to Armenia. And because I wanted to learn Eastern Armenian, I was admitted to AUA and also Yerevan State University. I chose Yerevan State University to enhance my Eastern Armenian language skills. I studied international relations there, and my focus was a bit diverted from human rights and genocide, but not very different. It was mainly focused on, or at least my thesis was focused on, US foreign policy in the Middle East since 1948 specifically, and the rise of quote-unquote terrorism. And I say quote-unquote terrorism because there is no legal definition of terrorism up until today. It's more of a political rhetoric issue. And today, obviously in 2011, March, the Syrian revolution started, which quickly devolved into a conflict, which then devolved even further into an ethno-sectarian battle of wills, I guess. And when the conflict reached Aleppo in 2012, and I was already living in Armenia at the time, the major flow of Syrian Armenians started from Aleppo specifically to Armenia. And at the time, initially, we came together with a group of Syrian Armenian activists, leaders from the Syrian Armenian community back in Aleppo, and we established an NGO which was affiliated with the Ministry of, or aligned with, or supported by the Ministry of Diaspora. It was called the Center for Coordination of Syrian Armenian Issues. About a year later, I personally parted ways from the organization, and we ended up creating the Aleppo Compatriotic Charitable Organization, which, and it was solely because we wanted to have complete freedom from any association with government entities, not just the Armenian government, but all sorts of governments. And we created the Aleppo NGO, let's say, and it's been conducting its operations, humanitarian relief operations, as well as exploring ways to come up with sustainable solutions for the Syrian Armenian quote-unquote refugees here in Armenia. But right before, or right around the time when we created the Aleppo organization, I left Armenia and went to Washington. Initially, I found a job, well, I did the ANC Gateway program, couldn't find a job in Washington for 3 months, moved to Boston and worked for the Armenian Weekly for about 6-7 months, and then eventually landed a job back in DC with the Middle East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch. Recently, in the last 3-4 months, I left Human Rights Watch as an employee, but I continue to consult for them as a Middle East and North Africa consultant, focusing primarily on Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and some of the other conflict countries like Yemen and Libya, as well as some human rights issues in Saudi Arabia. And I obviously, after returning back to Yerevan, I've been a lot more engaged with the groundwork and operations of Aleppo-NGO here in Yerevan in terms of implementing different projects and programs that the organization runs. At the moment, we have more than 12 or 13 programs that we implement to support Syrian refugees or repatriates here in Armenia. And while I was in the United States, we also created a second entity, which is essentially called the same name as the organization here, Aleppo Compatriotic Charitable Organization, but it's a completely separate legal entity in the United States. And that entity is focused on essentially conducting fundraising to support the NGO here in order for it to be able to implement its projects. I think I'll stop there, and I guess I'm open to any questions you may have on Syrian conflict, Syrian refugee issues, Human Rights Watch as an organization, human rights issues, IHL issues related to conflict countries in the Middle East.
So, where primarily are the Syrian refugees in Armenia living? Are they more in Yerevan or villages?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the conflict reached Aleppo in August, precisely July 19, 2012 was the day that the armed conflict reached around the city of Aleppo. And that's when the major flow of Syrian Armenians started in terms of repatriation to Armenia or resettlement in Armenia. Initially, I think Armenians and maybe many others, Syrians, non-Armenians, were hopeful that the conflict in Aleppo would be resolved within a few weeks. So a lot of the Armenians or Syrian Armenians who ended up in Armenia had thought that they would stay in Armenia for 2-3 weeks, maybe like a holiday type of trip that they had taken, and then everything would calm down and back in Aleppo, and they would return back to their homes. Obviously, initially the process was a lot of people came to Yerevan, they rented apartments in central locations in Yerevan city, which were a lot more expensive in terms of the rental costs. And then over time, when the conflict did not subside and it got even worse and worse over the ensuing months and years, a lot of people who had initially rented homes in central locations started moving out of the central parts of Yerevan into the outskirts of Yerevan. But for the most part, I think most would say more than 90% of Syrian Armenians who live in Armenia are based in Yerevan city. A small number live in Echmiadzin, a smaller number lives in Gyumri, and if my statistics are still accurate, in 2004 2014 when I visited or 2013 March when I visited Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh. There's the Tüfengen Foundation, which was implementing a resettlement project in the Kashatagh region of Artsakh. There were about 23 Syrian Armenian families who had moved there. So it's primarily based in Yerevan. I would say more than 90%, probably even more than 95% is in Yerevan or in the outskirts of Yerevan, and a very small number in different cities in different parts of Armenia and Artsakh.
And if I'm not mistaken, I heard that there's approximately 7,000 of them here now, or is that off?
So according to the official numbers provided by the Armenian government, approximately 23,000 Syrian Armenians have arrived to Armenia since July 2012. And out of those 23,000, approximately 15 to 16,000 still live in Armenia.
Okay.
So about 8,000 of the Syrian Armenians who arrived in Armenia, some of them obtained Armenian citizenship in order for them to be able to travel to Gulf countries where job opportunities were, they had a lot more job opportunities in the Gulf countries than in Armenia, and Armenia's difficult economy and job market. Some of them were unable to sustain themselves here in Armenia, so they unfortunately were forced to go back to the conflict zone back in Aleppo, so they returned home because they weren't able to either find jobs, or even the jobs that they were finding, the salaries that they were receiving was not enough for them to pay rent, utility costs, and support their families. And a few thousand, treated Armenia as a transit country in the sense that they fled Syria to Armenia and then ended up moving on to European countries like Sweden, Germany, Austria, some to Australia. And then in recent years, for the past year and a half or so, since Canada changed its policy or introduced a policy of taking in Syrian refugees, a lot of Syrian Armenians also traveled back to Beirut, because Beirut was the location from where the resettlement of refugees was taking place from Lebanon to Canada. So a few thousand or so Syrian Armenians, from the ones that are living in Beirut or in Lebanon, and also from the ones who moved from Armenia to Lebanon for the purpose of resettlement, ended up in Canada. That's the summary of the numbers. There's about 20,000+ Syrian Armenians in Lebanon today. Most are in Beirut, some in Anjar. Obviously, when the Kesab invasion took place in March 2013, I'm not good with dates, but I think that was the month and year. A lot of the Kesab Armenians fled Kesab and went to Latakia, which is the coastal areas of Syria, controlled by the government since the beginning of the conflict and throughout. And some of them ended up in Anjar, which is also a historically Armenian village similar to Kesab in Lebanon.
How has the living conditions for Syrian Armenians here changed over the last 6 years?
I think, at the very beginning, as I mentioned, a lot of them treated Armenia as a temporary place where they were going to reside. So there was a psychological barrier for Syrian Armenians who moved to Armenia, in the sense that they were reluctant to accept the fact that their lives in Syria was most likely never going to be restored, at least in the same manner that the community was functioning back in Aleppo. So I think once the conflict became a protracted one, it was prolonged, people started accepting the reality that the only option they have was to either go back into a conflict zone or to stay in Armenia. And so obviously Syrian Armenians, or Syrian refugees in general globally in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, anywhere. I think when people talk about refugees, they consider the label and they don't realize that these are just normal human beings and living in normal countries. And most countries are consisted from different layers of society, especially from an economic standpoint. So there was obviously the top 10-15% of Syrian Armenians who fled Syria, moved to Armenia, and brought with them a lot of resources, financial resources, and some of them had already invested in businesses in Armenia or had purchased apartments and homes in Armenia. So that top 15-20% or so who either owned homes or were able to purchase homes after the conflict in Syria started, came to the realization that they were forced to accept the reality that Syria was never going to go back to what it was, and they started investing in different businesses and creating a new life here in Armenia. There was the middle 35-40%, the middle class. Some of them decided to again take a risk. As you know, in the diaspora, there's a lot of negative sentiments regarding the business opportunities and investment opportunities in Armenia. Hopefully it's getting better, the perception of the diaspora towards Armenia. Maybe it's getting worse, I'm not sure. But a lot of them, again, took a risk and started investing in different businesses. I think the top, the main field in which Syrian Armenians definitely succeeded, and probably the blessing of the Syrian conflict, or the silver lining of the Syrian conflict, not just in the case of Armenia, but throughout the region and certainly in Europe, is that Syrians are very well known for their exquisite cuisine. So I would say the cuisine and the food market in Armenia has exponentially improved since the Syrian Armenians moved to Armenia, because they bring their own unique spices and flavors to the food that they serve, and Middle Eastern cuisine is in general famous for its taste. But also, I mean, in different in other fields as well. I mean, in the service industry as well, I think Syrian Armenians, some of them were maybe more fluent in English than local Armenians. Some of them were more willing to smile, let's say, as waiters or waitresses. I personally, when I was still in Armenia, I actually initially, this was at the very beginning when Syrian Armenians were moving to Armenia, I used to go and meet university students, and I was a university student myself, and I used to tell them, since your parents are unable to find jobs, then why don't you consider working part-time as a waiter or a waitress to support your family? And I mean, believe it or not, waiters and waitresses in this country make probably more money than people who work in ministries. So the money is proportionally, comparatively pretty good. But there was, again, a psychological barrier in terms of Armenians essentially no Armenian back in Syria ever worked as a waiter or a waitress. So it was very difficult for them to accept the fact that they have to go and work and serve people. And to encourage that, because I was involved with a lot of youth projects, and I started the Syrian Armenian Students Association here when I was still a student at Yerevan State University. I actually went and worked as a waiter myself for a few months, and I got media outlets to come and interview me as I was working as a waiter, as a way of kind of showing people that there's no shame in working. There's shame in not working, and it doesn't matter what you're doing. But I think over time, either due to the financial circumstances of their families, or accepting the reality that there's nothing wrong with working, a lot of people went into the service industry and ended up being managers of different cafes. And I think that sector has definitely improved. That's something positive, again, that came out of the Syrian in-migration to Armenia. And Unfortunately, there's the bottom 25-30%. About 5,000 to 6,000 Syrian Armenians who, up until today, struggle to meet their everyday needs in terms of rental costs, utilities, food, just the basics to survive. And without the support of international organizations like UNHCR, Save the Children, World Vision, and local organizations such as Aleppo, Mission Armenia, and several others, that 30% or so would most likely choose to leave or return back to Syria. So without the support from those organizations, that 5,000-6,000, I guess the poorer level of society would struggle to survive here. That's kind of the demographic breakdown of what the Syrian Armenian population is like. Your organization, actually, the organization you were working with, the International Center for Human Development, I think did a research in 2013, or a survey-based research that looked into also gender-based violence in the case of Syrian women, and both abuse since moving to Armenia and also while they were taking the journey from Syria to Armenia, because a lot of the poorer level or in December 2012, when the conflict reached one of its peaks in Aleppo, the Aleppo airport was shut down. And so most of the people who were making the journey from Syria to Armenia were either forced to travel to Beirut or travel through Turkey and then Georgia into Armenia. So there was a study that was done by ICHD, I believe, that found extremely interesting information in terms of both gender-based violence, but also access of children to education. And Syrian Armenian children, at least this was a study that was done in 2013, in the initial period, they were reluctant to go to school, or at least a portion of them were reluctant to go to school because of bullying issues, because of language barriers, the difference between Eastern and Western Armenian. So, I mean, there's a lot of challenges, and I think one of the biggest challenges of humanitarian organizations and relief organizations, not just in Armenia, but globally speaking, in Europe and in the surrounding countries to Syria, in terms of Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan. I think the one aspect of the Syrian refugee crisis, but not only Syrian refugees, refugees from all over the world, is the psychological issues, the trauma that refugees face as a result of living in a conflict type situation or being unable to integrate in the new societies and the new countries that they arrive to. I hope that answered the question.
Two questions. What were the main occupations of Syrian Armenians in Syria before the conflict, and how many people used to live before, and how many people are still living there, and how many of them are involved in this war, or maybe as soldiers, or and who are they blaming, the government, or who are they with?
So I mean, in terms of employment, I think, I guess, I mean, so the population of Aleppo, in terms of Armenians, the population of Aleppo was about 5 million in the entire governorate, and out of the 5 million, about 45 to 50,000 were Armenians. In terms of the occupations that they had, a lot of them were self-employed, small to mid-level business owners. I mean, they owned their own shops, whether it was auto body, construction. A lot of them were goldsmiths. A lot of them were factory owners. This is the higher the richer level of the population, they owned a lot of factories in different fields, in textile, in the food industry, and so on. So you can't really say what were the main occupations. I think it was a very diverse society in terms of what kind of jobs that they used to do. In terms of the numbers, it depends on which, there's no concrete data. There was no census that was conducted over the last 20, 30 years, but some estimate between 80 to 100,000 Armenians to have lived in Syria prior to 2011. And I personally would put the number around the 80,000, 90,000 figure. And today, again, there's no concrete data, but based on the number of the number of children that attend different schools, back in Aleppo and different parts of Syria, in Kamishli, in Damascus, and so on. In Latakia, a lot of people are internally displaced persons in the sense that their homes were destroyed, or the conflict in Aleppo forced them to flee in different parts of Syria inside the country, like the coastal areas. I would say the number is now about 30,000 or so Syrian Armenians still living in Syria. So in that context, if you compare the Syrian Armenian numbers in relation to the Syrian conflict and the Syrian refugee crisis, you see that Syrian Armenians, almost 60+% of them fled the country, left the country, whereas approximately 25% of Syrians, in total, out of the 23 million Syrians that were living there before 2011, about 5 million, potentially 6 million have fled the country, so about 25-30% have left. So Syrian Armenians, I guess due to their minority status, due to the fact that they do have part of their historic homeland in Armenia, and they had more options in terms of leaving to Lebanon, to Armenia, and some of them also had dual citizenship, for example, dual citizens of Canada, US, European countries. The numbers are higher in terms of the number of people who fled Syria. In terms of blaming sides of the conflict, the Syrian Armenian leadership's position since the very beginning of the events in Syria was one of positive neutrality, which is a similar position that the Lebanese Armenian community had taken up during the Lebanese civil war between 1975 and 1990. The Armenian community, as a matter of policy, has not supported any side of the conflict. However, as the conflict again devolved, I wouldn't say evolved, and as different extremist organizations rose in the context of the Syrian conflict, like ISIS, al-Nusra, which is an extension of al-Qaeda. I think most minority groups consider the current government of Syria, led by President Assad, as the protector of minorities. And because historically under the Ba'ath Party rule, under the current government, both in the time of Hafiz al-Assad, the father, and Bashar al-Assad today, historically it was a relatively secular society. I mean, if you go to Aleppo, you see a church and a mosque constructed right across the street from one another. And people in Aleppo, I mean, if you had lived there, nobody really knew who's Armenian, who's Sunni, who's Alawi, who's Kurdish, there's all sorts of ethno-sectarian compositions within Syria, the Druze, Shia, and so on. But nobody really knew who was what. Obviously, there was an acceptance that the Alawite sect controlled a lot of the government institutions, which is the sect controlled by representing the president of Syria, President Assad. But I think Armenians based on the history that they experienced over the last 40 something years under the current government, which was stability, security in exchange for essentially freedoms. I think they accepted the fact that, well, no freedom and democracy is going to come out of this situation. I mean, if the alternatives, the competing parties that emerge out of the conflict were the Syrian government and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, obviously ISIS and Al-Qaeda were not going to deliver freedoms and gender-based equality and democracy to Syria. So the natural position of the Syrian Armenians, I would say more than 99%, support the Syrian government. But I do want to conduct a survey one day, well, hopefully soon, in terms of Turkey had an obligation to remove all of its anti-personnel landmines from its borders in southern Turkey or northern Syria. But a lot of the fleeing refugees from Kobani to Suruj were being stranded in the landmine belt that separated the Turkey-Syria border. And one specific issue that we covered at the time, as well as, let's say, kidnapping and torture of Kurdish children by ISIS in Aleppo, was the landmine issue, which was basically meeting victims of landmines who had been either maimed or killed, a woman that had lost her leg only a few days prior than the day I met her. So it's basically being on the ground and interviewing eyewitnesses and victims. One thing that separates, let's say, the work that Human Rights Watch does and its credibility from, let's say, media outlets is that, unlike journalists, we do base our investigation on eyewitnesses and or victims of torture, arbitrary detention, police brutality, whatever the context that may be, indiscriminate shelling, landmines, and so on. And also, we don't base our reports or our press releases on one source. We tend to check the information that we've received from one eyewitness account with several eyewitness accounts, and if it's not possible, then we would then use satellite imagery in the context of conflict countries to kind of do an overview of the area that was bombarded by different groups, to see the extent of the damage and the accuracy of the information that we had received from the eyewitnesses and the victims, in terms of checking the exact hours when the attacks took place, the exact locations, and we cross-check it through satellite imagery, through social media. Social media, again, I mean, it's a large part of the work that we do, in the sense that you've got activists on the ground instantaneously putting videos. So it's, you know, you get the video, you get the eyewitness account, you cross-check it with satellite images and other sources of information, and then a product is usually put out in terms of a press release, which is usually 2 pages to up to 10 pages, or reports that can be as long as, let's say, 100 pages.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I talk a lot.
No, it was, you know what, it was fascinating, and if you let me, I can probably ask you more questions, and we'll be here for 3 more hours. I am very glad that we've reconnected, and I'm so proud to know you, and to know that the good work, that you're doing. I do want to talk with you more about your work, and I'm curious, do you get to Washington?
I don't foresee myself going back to the U.S. for about a year.
Okay.
But I do visit Washington whenever I do end up going to the States.
Okay, I think it's really important for our organization's leadership, our members of Congress, and others in Washington hear from you about this, because you have a very unique perspective and experience and education and upbringing that will have maybe, perhaps, hopefully shed some light for people to better understand what's happening in Syria and in the region today. So let's
No,
see.
I've also definitely met with Brian, Ruben, Tanyel on multiple occasions when I was still based in Washington, and
I want
they're
to
doing an
revitalize
incredible-
that and get that
Yeah,
going
yeah,
again.
Definitely.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mrs. Sarkis Balkhian, who is an amazing person, who's doing amazing work that some of us can only think about and wonder about, but he's actually out in the field doing it, and he's got a very sobering perspective for all of us to consider about the realities on the ground today in the Middle East and in this region. So thank you so much, Sarkis.
Thank you for having me and inviting me.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.